1983 was one of the darkest years in the history of the Scotch whiskey industry. That year, nearly 20 distilleries closed their doors, 9 of them never to reopen again. What I have in this glass beside me here is from one of those distilleries that closed in 1983. It's a 1982 40-year-old Glen Mhor from Gordon Macphail from a Refill Sherry Hogshead. And I feel very blessed and lucky to have this in my glass, because this is likely the first and only time I'll ever be able to try something from this distillery. And while it's only a sample, I figured it was a great opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the history of Glen Mhor, to talk to you a little bit about one of the things that Gordon Macphail does so well, which is really nurturing these stocks of really rare, old, and closed distilleries and releasing them in bottlings for people to share out in samples like this one, and to just share an experience with you that, again, I don't know if I'm ever gonna have again. My name is Matt, and this is Whiskey on the West Coast. Glen Mhor, which means Great Glen or Great Valley, was founded in 1892 by John Burney and Charles McKinley. Now, it's located in Inverness and was one of 3 notable distilleries to have operated in the area, the others being Glenalbin and Millburn. Now, the water source for the distillery is the River Ness, which flows out of Loch Ness. Yes, that Loch Ness. An interesting historical footnote about Glen Mhor is that in 1907, Ernest Shackleton shipped out with bottles of McKinley's rare old Highland malt for his expedition to the South Pole. Now, if you're familiar with the McKinley's blended Scotch that's on the market, you'll probably know the story, but some of these bottles were later uncovered and excavated from the ice beneath his cabin in the Antarctic. Now, when these bottles, the whiskey inside of them, was scientifically examined and analyzed, they confirmed that one of the main sources for this whiskey was the Glen Mhor Distillery, which I think is just such a cool story. It really makes me excited to be drinking something that has a tie to the Shackleton expedition. In 1914, Glen Mhor and Glenalbin were requisitioned by the government and actually occupied by the US Navy during the First World War. And the site was used for a number of different purposes, but one of the purposes was to create mines for the war effort. Now, there wasn't whiskey being made at this time, and in fact, production didn't restart at Glen Mhor until March 1st, 1919. Now, a few other really interesting footnotes about Glen Mhor's history, and in particular production history. The distillery remained water-powered into the 1950s. And on top of this, it was actually kind of a pioneering distillery in that they were the first to install Saladin boxes for their malting purposes in the 1950s as well. In 1980, I believe, these Saladin boxes were removed and on-site malting stopped at Glen Mhor. My understanding is that the whiskeys that were made after this were using peated malt centrally sourced from maltsters elsewhere in Scotland. But I note it was a peated malt. I don't know what phenol count it was at, but that I do find that interesting because we're dealing with, in this glass beside me here, a 40-year-old lightly peated malt. I really don't know enough about Glen Mhor to know how heavily peated this would have been, but it is enough to know that it was a peated malt being used. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Glen Mhor was one of many distilleries to fall victim to the whiskey lock, closing in 1983. Now, this could have largely been due to the fact that the distillery required a lot of repairs and modernization at that time, and it made it an easy target for DCL to go ahead and close down. Sadly, after 1983, in 1986, the heart of the distillery was removed. The stills were taken out. And in 1989 or 1988, there's a little bit of disagreement on this, the Glen Mhor buildings were demolished. Today, there stands a shopping mall where both Glen Mhor and Glenalbin used to stand. Now, as I mentioned, this whiskey in my glass, this is a Gordon and Macphail Glen Mhor bottling. Now, I've gone on Whiskey Base and I tried to find just how many bottlings of Glen Mhor have been released in the last decade, because I've never physically seen one with my own eyes. And of the bottlings released in the last decade, I've only found there's 7 of them. And of those 7, I believe the majority were released by Gordon and Macphail. And that's the amazing thing about Gordon Macphail, because they've been doing this, doing independent bottling for so long. They have such incredible depth of stocks and of distilleries that no one else has aging in their warehouse. And the quality of the casks and the microclimate in those warehouses ensures that these whiskeys, these casks of whiskeys, can mature for decades and decades and decades. So a bit about the whiskey in my glass beside me here. This is a Gordon Macphail Private Collection Glen Mhor 1982. It's a Highland single malt Scotch distillery. This is cask number 72. Distilled 1982, bottled in 2022. It's 40 years old, bottled at 50.8% ABV. That's an incredible ABV for a 40-year-old whiskey. Non-chill filtered, it's natural color, from a Refill Sherry Hogshead. There was 174 bottles of this made, and it comes in at what's probably a fair price, but again, a price I'll never be able to pay for a bottle of about $4,200 Canadian. I feel really fortunate to get a chance to try this. And one of the reasons why I'm sharing this on the channel again is because I don't know if I'll ever have a chance to review a Glen Mhor again. I figured it, even for just my own whiskey journey, almost as if whiskey on the West Coast is sometimes a personal whiskey journal of myself. I wanted to have a record of my tasting notes and my experience trying this history in a glass. So let's get to the review. All right, Glen Mhor 1982. An absolute antique nose. Smells of an old bookshop or an old library, which is always a good sign for a whiskey, in my opinion. It's a meaty whiskey, and I wonder if that's coming from the sherry or the spirit. I have read that Glen Mhor can be a fatty, meaty, oily spirit, and from what's in this glass, I'd believe it. Yeah, real sweet and savory dynamic going on here, and just an austere nose. Just wow, really, really beautiful nose. Tobacco, like roasted coffee notes, teriyaki sauce or soy sauce. But that the sweet notes along with those savory notes, it's like sweet and sour pork, but with shavings of dark chocolate. Like, there's so much going on here. Sultanas, so like raisins, like apricot, candied fruit, or like fruit leather, with also actual like worn leather. Yeah, smells like freshly polished wood, but like old wood. Now, right button up against that is like a fresh raspberry note too. And probably the weirdest inclination I'm getting from this nose is almost like an aged solvent, like wood varnish that's been left in an old like gallon tin in a garage for a long time. You crack that open, you get a whiff of what's going on in there. Yeah, oh man. It's like 40-year-old oak-aged honey. Yeah, blended with like the most incredible black tea. Like, oh man. I have probably spent over an hour nosing this whiskey, and I could probably continue to nose this whiskey for hours. It's bloody incredible. Yeah, that's inviting me to take a sip here. Thank you for joining me for this tasting, guys. I know it's a little weird to be reviewing something that I think very few of you will have a chance to try. Some of you might have been part of the same Kensington Wine Market tasting where I got this sample from. So if you have tried this, comment down below what your thoughts of it were. All right, going to the palate. Slunge. Honeycomb, tobacco, savory glazed meats, and fig spread. Oh man, this is bursting with flavor. My word. Mocha, chocolate and coffee just intermingled, but in like the richest form imaginable. Yeah, chocolate covered coffee bean too on the finish right now, but dark chocolate from the almost tannic sort of notes here from the oak is leaning it more towards that kind of bitter chocolate, but not in any way like a bad bitter. There's like this industrial note verging on earthy, possibly like going towards like rubber or tar, but I think it's more earthy than industrial. And perhaps that's the effect of that, like that peated malt being rounded over by those oak casks. Perhaps that's what's happened with that over time. I know like old aged Islay whiskeys, the peat comes off much differently. Because I'm not picking up peat in this whiskey. So perhaps those earthier tones, that's where those are coming from, perhaps. Throughout this whiskey, the oak provides a really robust structure for everything that the spirit wants to tell us, wants to show us. Wood polish, leather, tobacco, and really all the best qualities of like an old vintage Armagnac. I have a few Armagnacs in my collection, and I'm really enjoying getting to know that spirit. And I think there's something verging on like a funky, nutty, savory note that's almost verging on like rancio, if you're familiar with that from tasting notes or from old whiskeys you've had in the past. I haven't had as many old whiskeys that I'd like to have, obviously. And I've only had rancio notes in a few whiskeys, but I'd say this has some of that. It's just like, yeah, this whiskey. It's of another era, of another time, obviously, and it just leaves you speechless. This is beautiful stuff, and I'm always going to remember having a chance to try this Glen Mhor 1982. I think of note, a lot of the information I found on the history came from a website that was set up by Jason, who went by the moniker, I believe, Dallas Mhor on Dramface. And he's been instrumental in researching the history of this distillery and putting it into a website. I believe it's called glenmhordistillery.com. So if you do a Google search for Glen Mhor Distillery, it's one of the first websites to come up. If you want to learn more about Glen Mhor, extensive research has been done, looking at even like old journals, looking at town records, really like a most incredible record of history on this distillery. I have never had anything quite like this. This is singular and unique in my whiskey experience. And it's something that I'm not sure anyone else other than Gordon Macphail could provide in the 2020s. I'm not sure if anyone else really has any stocks of Glen Mhor left. I know Cadenhead's had some. I believe Signatory had some. But Cadenhead's, their last bottlings of Glen Mhor, I believe, were on the back end of the last decade. And I believe there was maybe one Signatory bottling. So yeah, I'm just, this is a knockout whiskey. Will I ever have something like this again? Perhaps from a different distillery, but it won't quite be like this. So I should hurry up, take my last sip here, and give you guys a score. Though score is really more academic than anything with a whiskey like this, isn't it? It is its own beast. It is its own animal. Again, quite a singular experience. Yeah, this is gonna get the highest score so far on the channel. I'm giving this whiskey, this Glen Mhor 1982 from the Gordon Macphail private collection, 40 years old. It's getting a 94 out of 100. I could only imagine what an open bottle of this, once you get it down after a few pours, down to the shoulders, let it oxidize a bit, I can only imagine how good this whiskey could shape up, because I've had this in my glass again, probably an hour and a half now. It hasn't lost strength. It is still full of vigor. Yeah, quite simply just an incredible whiskey, and really brings me back to the point why I'm doing these Gordon Macphail videos right now, is because I'm getting ready for the Gordon Macphail Grand Tasting at the Victoria Whiskey Festival, hosted by Richard Urquhart, one of the owners of Gordon Macphail, one of the family members that runs it. I cannot wait. I cannot wait. I cannot wait to tell you guys all about my experience at the Victoria Whiskey Festival. I hope I'll meet some of you there. And until next time, from the West Coast, Slange.